If you guys are experiencing any server performance issues or you notice that your players are having lag spikes in your server, these are the top 10 tips that I found for you guys. Let's dive right in. Tip number 1, disable chickens. Just because they're not very valuable to players and there's no point in having that one extra AI on your map using up resources. Tip number 2 is disabling your ai.think, which makes it to where all of your AI, such as your animals and your NPCs, are not going to shoot or react to players. This is game changing, so bear in mind, only use this one if you really need to, but it will make a pretty big difference as far as your server performance goes. Tip number 3, removing any unneeded plugins or trying to optimize your plugins as much as you can. The more plugins you have, the more it's utilizing your server to have those ran, especially if they have a lot of internal timers or they're doing tasks repetitively. So reducing your plugins undoubtedly will help out performance for anything that you don't need particularly. Tip number 4, this one is probably the absolute best on this list, and this is your server hardware and your host. If you have really low-end hardware, more than likely you're going to hit a point where you're starting to get a lot of players and you notice a lot of decline in your server performance. I highly recommend you either upgrade your server hardware itself with your current host, or you upgrade to your host in general. The host I recommend is Game Server Kings. I'll have a link down in the description to them. Could not be more impressed with their network, their DDoS protection, as well as their hardware. So be sure to give them a check in the description below. That one is undoubtedly the best change you can do for your server. Tip number 5, this one does take a few extra steps, but you can launch up your server's map on your server, connect to it with your local Rust client like you're going to play on your server. Once you connect to it, it'll download that map. You can open up the map in a map editor such as Rustedit, and a few tips that I recommend, especially for map makers, is smoothing steep terrain, because steep terrain adds more polygons and vertices on the map for clients to load in, and the more that there are, the lower their performance will be. So smoothing out steep terrain definitely helps. Additionally, you can remove any extra decorative prefabs such as power lines, road signs, electrical boxes on the road, stuff like that, just to have less entities on your map and increase your performance that way. Tip number 6 is actually adding plugins that help improve your server performance. Contrary to the tip just a moment ago, there are actually plugins that help your server performance by removing entities on your map that aren't needed, such as signs or mailboxes that are outside of your player's build radius and they're just spammed across the map. It can actually remove those. I'll include a few links to Umod in the description below for a couple of plugins that I recommend, and that'll definitely help out your server performance a bit. Tip number 7 is capping your server FPS. Some people can believe otherwise, but capping your server FPS can have a huge gain on your server performance in the long run, since it's not utilizing your entire machine just to have a little bit of extra performance gain, because players will not notice the difference if your server is running at 20 frames or if it's at 256 frames. Tip number 8 is actually increasing your upkeep as well as your decay rate, especially if you run a server that's higher than vanilla gather rate, such as a 2 times or a 5 or 10 or 100 times. Tip number 9, probably the most simple one, is just restart your server. It's good for not only the hardware itself, but as well as the Oxide and plugins as well. You'll definitely notice less lag spikes if you do this. Tip number 10 is just avoiding super large maps. Honestly, if your server only has 10 pop, there's no point in running a 4500 size map, because not only is your server going to take longer to boot up and add more of a FPS drop for players, but it also adds a little bit more for your server as well, because it's having to keep up with all the entities such as the trees and animals and AI navigation. So reducing your map size a little bit for your player population is definitely a recommended tip. But if you do get really high population, by all means, you can use 4K 4500 size maps or larger. But whenever you get to that range, you need to have really good hardware on a machine. Anyway, guys, that wraps up this tips and tricks video for your server performance. I do want to note that by no means I am a server professional or anything. These are just the tips that I've found out over time from looking at websites or resources or even learning on my own. So I hope this guide helps you guys out with your server performance if you are experiencing anything. Again, the biggest one is probably just your host and your hardware. Again, I'll just mention the link in the description below to Game Server Kings. They can definitely set you up with a good machine as well as DDoS protection. But otherwise, that's pretty much it, guys. Hope you guys have a good one, and I will see you soon.